Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. I know what you need, some more rock and read. Today we will continue our journey through the book The Lives of Brian, written by AC/DC's lead singer, Brian Johnson. I believe we're on Chapter 6. Chapter 6 is called The Scrogg. Let's see what happens next. The offer from Parsons should have set me up for life. For the next 5 years, I was going to get the benefit of one of the most advanced and rigorous technical apprenticeships anywhere in the world. After that, I'd become the first Johnson to wear a shirt to work, to join the middle class. And if I kept at it and worked hard, the sky was the limit. A car, holidays abroad, my own 3-bedroom house, all the things that my dad could only have dreamed about in 1945. It wasn't like Parsons was a boring company to work for either. I felt like a little kid when I first walked into the main building in Heaton. The white machine shop, they called it, which took up the space of 20 football fields, churning out steam turbines that were shipped in navies and power plants all over the world. The tool makers, the fitters, the turners, the pattern makers, the panel beaters, what those guys did in there was incredible. To me, the blades, valves, and bearing cases they made weren't just parts, they were things of beauty. It was Sir Charles Parsons' nephew Norman who was running the place by then. He was a bit of a legend. In fact, was Mr. Parsons, because he knew every nut and bolt on every machine, and he didn't mind getting his hands dirty. He had a bone-dry sense of humor, too. My favorite story about him was when he was showing a turbine, a massive thing, the size of a double-decker bus, to some students from Oxford University. One of the students pointed to a steel rod poking out of it and asked what it was for. "Well, that's an emergency stop pin," explained Mr. Parsons. "We use it as a kind of brake if the turbine ever spins too fast, so it doesn't come off its mountings." "And if it fails," asked the student, "what steps do you take?" "Well, there's a second pin," Mr. Parsons went on, "although we almost never have to use that one. And in the extremely unlikely event that also fails, there's even a third pin, much, much bigger than the others, which rams itself into the rotor, basically destroying the turbine, but preventing a potentially fatal accident." There was a long pause while the student scribbled in his notebook. Then he looked up again and frowned. "And what steps do you take if that doesn't work?" "Big ones." I could tell you all about how I started as a dog's body in the Parsons General Drawing Office, delivering plans to the shop floor, or about my time at apprentice school right there in the factory, followed by my night and day classes at Apprentice College in Gateshead, where I eventually passed my city and guilds exams and got my Tech 3 certificate, going on to become a brown-coated trainee inspector, then a trainee marker off, drawing lines for the drillers and borers. I could even tell you about my first time on a freehand lathe, which could rotate a part any way you wanted. So you could cut it, sand it, knurl it, turn it, whatever your heart desired. Just so long as every measurement and angle was absolutely perfect, or else the highly skilled foreman overseeing your work would tell you to start again. But the truth was, there was only one thing on my mind in those days, and it wasn't steam turbines. What I was obsessed with, what I just could not get enough of, was music. This was the beginning of Beatlemania and the British invasion, after all, with the blues and rockabilly styles of the 1950s rapidly evolving into something harder and louder. An absolutely electrifying time to be alive. And of course, one of the most exciting bands in the charts was from right there in Newcastle, the Animals. In fact, the Animals' bass player, Brian James Chaz Chandler, had once worked on the very same lake that I was using at Parsons, which made becoming a rock star feel like something that might actually be possible rather than something that just happened to people in London or Liverpool. I even flirted for a while with the idea that the lake might have magical powers that could be bestowed on me. Years later, I mentioned that to my great friend Jimmy Nail, another ex-Parsons apprentice, and he used it as the storyline in his 1990s BBC drama, Crocodile Shoes. I got a massive kick out of his character in the show mentioning my name. Adding to the excitement was just how forbidden and dangerous this new type of music felt at the time. Until Radio 1 launched, the BBC refused to play any kind of rock and roll for fear of corrupting the nation's youth. If you wanted to hear it, you had to hunt around the medium wave frequencies on your parents' wireless set to find the pirate stations, like Radio Caroline. The latter broadcast from various ships with military-style transmitters in international waters. Not that you could really listen to pirate radio as far north as Newcastle. The reception was so bad that for every 2 seconds of music you heard, you got another minute of interference. As strange as it is to admit, the music of the 1960s that I first became obsessed with wasn't even rock and roll. Instead, it was the work of a sensitive, curly-haired young folk singer from the other side of the pond. And I discovered Dylan completely by accident. There was a girl I was sort of going out with at the time. Her name escapes me, I'm sorry to say, and she was working at a record shop on Clayton Street in Newcastle. I'd pop in there on a Saturday morning to say hello, and of course, it was torture, because I wanted to buy everything at the place, but records were far beyond my means. My apprentice's wage was just £1, 17 shillings, and 6 pence a week, and about a third of that went to my ma for room and board, with the rest going to bus fares and the odd bag of chips. I didn't even have my own record player. If I wanted to listen to an LP, I had to go over to my cousin Stuart's house and listen to his records. Anyway, I was in there one day, flirting away with this girl by the cash till. Getting my end away was pretty high up on my list of priorities, when she pointed to a stack of albums and said, "Look, these came in last month, but no one's buying them. They'll be sent back to the record company first thing on Monday." And there it was, Bob Dylan's Freewheelin', his first album of mostly original songs before The Times They Are A-Changin' turned him into an icon, with the man himself on the cover, standing moodily on a street corner in New York's Greenwich Village, shoulders hunched in the cold, a beautiful long-haired lass in a long coat and boots clinging onto his arm. It was just the coolest thing I'd ever seen in my life. "Who's Bob Dylan?" "No idea," she shrugged. Then she grabbed the record and stuffed it into my jumper, making me look like I had two very pointy square nipples. "Now quick, bugger off." For a minute, I was paralyzed. I wasn't a thief, and I hated stealing of any kind, something I'd got from my dad. But this girl was a stunner, and I wasn't going to do anything that might stand in the way of a snog, or better yet, a shag. So I went, "Right, okay, thanks," and legged it. An hour or two later, I was sitting on my cousin Stuart's living room floor next to his turntable, ready to put on the album that I had just been gifted. He was a strange lad, was Stuart, with a love of Dusty Springfield and a poster of Marlene Dietrich on his wall. But from the first line of the first song, Blowin' in the Wind, of course, we were both in a trance. Every chord, every word, every breath just felt so heady and dangerous, like one man and his guitar really could change the world. I soon diversified from Dylan, thanks to my sort of girlfriend on Clayton Street. It wasn't just unsold stock she'd slip me. She'd also give me the samples she got from record label reps. The one I listened to the most was the album by the Paul Butterfield Blues Band. There was no title. The band name was all you got, and it had "Play it full volume for the best effect" written on the back cover. The music was just sensational. I got my mojo working, Shake Your Moneymaker, Look Over Yonder's Wall, Born in Chicago, Mystery Train. There were mostly covers of traditional black Chicago blues songs, of course, but Butterfield and his band turned up their amps so loud you could imagine the lights dimming across the entire state of Illinois when they started to play. Every time I put it on, I'd grin from ear to ear. It didn't take long before I'd found a few other apprentices at Parsons who liked the same music that I did. And of course, one thing led to another, and before I knew it, I was in my first band. We were a quartet called Section 5. And if you think that's a stupid name, you should have heard some of the other suggestions. Everyone's band had a stupid name in those days. One of the biggest acts on the Northeast club gig circuit at the time was called Mr. Pooh-Bah's Chicago Line, and no one even batted an eyelid at that. Admittedly, calling ourselves a band was a bit of a stretch. We didn't have any gigs, we didn't have any fans, and we didn't know any songs. Other than that, though, we were all set for a glittering career of chart-topping success. On bass was a wonderful young lad named Steve Chance, who had managed to get himself this gorgeous Rossetti guitar, along with a matching 50-watt amp, on a hire purchase agreement. Handedly, Steve also had an older brother, Wes, who taught himself to play lead guitar on a Hofner very thin semi-acoustic. Wes was the only member of the band who wasn't an apprentice at Parsons. On drums, meanwhile, was a guy named Robert Conlon, a solid addition to the lineup in every way but one. He couldn't actually play the drums. He did have an amazing kit, though, all brand new Rogers gear, because he was an only child and his parents spoiled him rotten. During his short time in the band, Rob seemed to be firmly of the opinion that it was physically impossible to use one foot to play the bass drum while the other controlled the hi-hats, especially if he was also using his arms. Not that it mattered. Steve's amp was so loud, you really couldn't hear anything else. As for me, I had flirted with playing an instrument myself. Paul Butterfield's harmonica in particular was an inspiration. I wished I could play like him, but I tried and couldn't get the hang of it. It was the same with every other instrument. I just didn't have the concentration. I couldn't even master the guitar in a conventional sense, playing one chord after the other. My fingers felt like sausages. So I stuck with what I had been born with, my voice and a lot of guts. With Steve's amp to compete with, I soon realized that I couldn't just scream at the top of my voice. I needed some equipment of my own. But I was earning a pittance as an apprentice, which left me with no choice but to go cap in hand to my old man. "Dad," I said, taking a deep breath, "I need a PA system." "What?" "You know, like a microphone and speakers with a little amp, for playing shows like, because I've decided I want to be a professional singer." That got his attention. "A professional what?" A sudden look of panic in his eyes. "A professional singer, Dad." "Yes, I heard you the first time, and I still think you're daft. Now Johnny Cash is a real singer, and you're no Johnny Cash, so forget about it." "Dad, I'm serious." To be fair to my old man, of course, no Johnson in history had ever been in the entertainment business, so all this was completely alien to him. After enough nagging, though, he finally came around. So off we went to the number 66 bus via Marlborough Crescent, the good old Dunstan Circular, to Miller's Music, which was in a basement just off Pink Lane in Newcastle. It was heaven to me, that place with all the shiny new guitars, amps, keyboards, and drums. Once my dad had signed the hire purchase agreement, there was a £3 and 10 shillings deposit, followed by weekly payments of 10 shillings and 6 pence, which had to be made in person at the counter. I walked out with a brand new crystal handheld mic and 10-watt Watkins amplifier, made in England, stamped on the back. I couldn't have been happier, and my dad couldn't have been more skeptical. "If you miss one payment, son," he snapped, "it's going back." Band rehearsals were every Saturday afternoon at the Chance's house in Walker. I was so excited. I'd take the 11:30 a.m. bus and get there just before lunch. I loved the looks I got when I carried my PA system onto the bus and people realized that I must be a musician, which felt dead cool in mid-1960s Gateshead. But the feeling soon disappeared when I realized that I'd have to lug the same gear from the bus stop in Walker to the Chance's house, a good half-a-mile walk. The Chance's house wasn't a normal semi-detached like ours. It was a steel-framed prefabricated bungalow that had been built in a factory and transported by road to the estate in Walker where they lived. All the houses on the estate were prefabs. They had built tens of thousands of the things after the war to try and end the housing shortage caused by the Blitz and the baby boom. Unless you were the rent man, you'd always use the back door, which took you straight into a tiny kitchen. Beyond that, there were the living room and a narrow hallway that led to the 2 small bedrooms. Of course, the living room was Mrs. Chance's pride and joy, complete with sideboard, TV, and best china, rounded off by Peter the Budgie, the family pet. The only place for us to set up our gear and rehearse was in Steve and Wes's bedroom. I'd stand at the foot of the bed, my little 10-watt Watkins amp on the mattress itself, with Steve and Wes on either side. Meanwhile, Rob would set up his kit in the doorway, his butt sticking out into the hall. And even though the entire house was the size of only 3 or 4 parking spaces, Steve's mom and dad, God bless them both, didn't mind at all. They were the most wonderful people you could ever imagine. They really were. Always so smiley and proud. Steve's mom was gorgeous too. Every week we'd take over that room and make the most terrible racket for hours on end. And they never once told us to stop. It's so rare to find people like that, who encourage you at the time of life when you need it most. Looking back, those Saturdays in the Chance's prefab were some of the happiest of my life. And exciting too, because it seemed like we could do anything if we just tried. The first songs we learned were straight off the Stones' first album. Dead easy stuff to play. Route 66, Mona, I Just Want to Make Love to You, and best of all, I'm a King Bee, the Stones' cover of the classic Muddy Waters track. We knew we weren't very good, of course, but with every Saturday that went by, we got closer to touching something that we couldn't have dreamed of touching before, something otherwise completely unattainable in our industrial, working-class world. A sense of glamour and excitement, and sex and adventure, I suppose. And when we finally made it through a song without stopping, it just felt absolutely magical. But I also got bored quickly. Right, I'd say after I'd sung the last line, why don't we try something else, eh? No, Steve would reply. We gotta do this again until we get it right. But we just did it twice. Oi, and it still sounds like... We gotta practice, man. Oh, for sake. I'd love to tell you that I've since become more of a patient man. But I'd be lying, so I won't. In the early days of those Saturday afternoon rehearsals, I must have been 16 or 17, the decision was made to celebrate our mastery of a new Rolling Stones number by going out for a pint. My first ever pint, as it so happened, or at least the first one that I would ever order for myself in a pub. So we took the bus to a Walker institution called the Scrogg, a name that managed to sum up everything about the place, from the walking in mud to the cigarette tar that dripped from the ceiling. When I say we took the bus, I mean the bus stopped right outside the front door, because in the Northeast, it's written in stone somewhere that a bus stop can't ever be more than 3 paces from a pint. Then it was time to take a deep breath and make our entrance, which we did, only to be almost knocked unconscious by a fog of sweat, beer fumes, and disinfectant that hung in the air, along with the plumes of smoke from the overflowing ashtrays and our fellow patrons' blackened lungs. We almost walked straight out again, but everyone else was breathing the same air, and they were all still alive. Well, barely. Movement was not a common sight. It was obvious that we were underage, but the Scrogg wasn't the kind of place where people ask questions, a question being too close to a conversation for anyone's liking. I had no idea what to drink. I just knew the word beer, but Les told me to order a black velvet instead. This was half a pint of stout, mixed with half a pint of strong cider, and I was like, this tastes good. So, down it went, and up went my confidence. Then it was, let's have another one, 3 or 4 more times. The only interruption being a quick trip outside to piss against the wall, pint still in hand, tab still in mouth. Because the only way you could have survived the toilets was with a gas mask and an oxygen tank, and I hadn't brought either. Now, I probably don't need to explain to you what happens to a 5'6" teenager when he drinks 4 pints of beer without food in his stomach, having never smelled the proverbial barmaid's apron before. I became suddenly, fabulously, paralytically drunk, as did Steve, Les, and Rob. Only they were quite a bit bigger than me, so they at least retained a few basic functions, such as the ability to talk. I, on the other hand, was just one big vowel movement. "Let's get the bus home," slurred Steve. "I know where my dad hides his whiskey." "Yes!" the others cried before we set out on the long, treacherous voyage back outside. What I remember next is waiting on the pavement for the bus with a very neatly trimmed privet hedge behind me and a full moon overhead. Then suddenly the moon moved, and not just a little bit, but across the entire universe before disappearing completely. Wow, that must have been a shooting moon, I thought, before realizing I had lost my balance, fallen backwards, and was now lying face up in the hedge, hands still in pockets. A strange sensation, like being in handcuffs. "Where's Brian?" I heard Steve ask Les. "He was standing right there a moment ago." Then somebody noticed my feet sticking out from the privet, and a great deal of merriment ensued. When the bus arrived, I somehow managed to unfall out of the hedge and get myself upright before making my way to the upper deck. The main topic of conversation, I seem to remember, was my state of drunkenness and how very funny that was. Then a strange feeling came over me, or rather, came over my stomach. I wasn't sure what it was, but it felt like something trying to get out. Then I started to make a series of strange noises, at which point it seemed like a good idea to open the window next to me. But the upper decks of buses had very small windows, about 4 inches across, and they opened sideways, which was a problem because a great deal of liquid and whatever remained of my lunch and breakfast was now coming up my throat with the velocity of a mortar shell. I had no choice. Even though I knew that puking at a 90-degree angle out of a 4-inch window while traveling at 40 miles per hour would be impossible, I tried it anyway. When I was done, all the laughing had stopped, and a lot of screaming had started because everyone around me was now covered in the contents of my stomach. When we finally got back to the Chance's house, Mrs. Chance declared that I was in no state to go back to Dunstan and should sleep with Steve and Les, 3 of us in a bed. So, that's what happened. And of course, I vomited again, but this time, luckily, there was something there to catch it. Steve's new state-of-the-art Chelsea boots. Oh, this was the kind of night of which legends are made. I'd love to tell you that I'd learned something important from the experience of drinking too much, but most of all, I just wanted to do it again. And we did. Many other adventures of the Scrogg followed, and one tragedy. The latter occurred when we came back to Steve's with a little too much loudmouth soup in our bellies. Steve slumped down on the sofa, and we followed. Miss Chance said, "I'll make you all a nice cup of tea." She went to the kitchen and said, "Where's Peter?" "Come on, Peter, my little boy. Come to Mom." But Peter, a much-loved member of the family who used to sit on people's shoulders, sip tea, peck on biscuits, and watch the BBC News, was nowhere to be seen. "Oh my," Miss Chance said. "He must have flown out when you came in. The cats will get him." So Mr. and Mrs. Chance went out in the street, calling for little Peter. We didn't move. Steve was farting professionally, and we smiled, nodding our approval. Then the horror, when the stink hit at half the speed of smell. Miss Chance was distraught when she came back in, dabbing her eyes, when Steve suddenly got up, and it was then we realized where Peter had been, dying a horrible death under the dancing buttocks of Steve Chance. Mr. Chance tried to resuscitate him, but no luck. The crossed eyes were definitely the result of broken wind. A sad end to the night, and to Peter's life. As a punishment, Steve got no breakfast and the stink eye from Mrs. Chance the next day. As for me, I made myself sick from alcohol a few more times after the Scrogg, but not too many. I'm lucky, I suppose, that I have this alarm bell in my brain that says, "That's enough, Brian." And I stop before things get out of control. If any of my friends are reading this, of course, they're probably thinking, "Brian, you're a lying." But that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Well, that's the end of Chapter 6. Poor Peter. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 6 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.